Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the organizer for giving me this opportunity to join you today. So some weeks ago, the IPCC warned us, or maybe just reminded us, that we have simply no time to waste. Global emissions need to peak before 2025. We need to halve CO2 emissions by 2030 to ensure that we can keep the door to 1.5 degrees open. And this is precisely the message that we outlined in our net zero report that we have published a year ago, in which the next decade witnesses a profound transformation. A profound transformation, yes, but we think it's still a feasible pathway. Why do we believe so? Because during the next decade, emissions reductions are mostly achieved through existing technologies that are commercially viable today. So first, if we look at the electricity sector, 2020 and then again 2021 were record years for renewables deployment. This level still, and the level that we had in 2020 still needs to quadruple by 2030. And the good news is that such exponential growth is nothing new for the solar PV and wind sector. Then, once our electricity gets cleaner, then using it to heat our homes and charge our cars will further decarbonize our economies. So in 2020, 5% of all cars sold globally were electric. In 2021, this share has almost reached 10%. While, of course, this growth is very impressive, we still have work to do, because by 2030, in our net zero scenario, the share of electric cars in terms of sales needs to rise to 60%. Another key area for the next decade is clearly energy efficiency. For buildings, we need to rapidly increase the rate of retrofitting, particularly in advanced economies, because with the current policies and incentives that we have today, only 1 out of 20 buildings will be retrofitted by 2030. But according to our net zero pathway, efforts need to be accelerated to bring this ratio to 1 out of 5 buildings by 2030. So clearly, the next decade is a decade of deployment, deployment, deployment. The key question is, will that be sufficient? And of course not. So far I have talked about the easy to decarbonize sectors, but we need also to decarbonize other sectors, not only electricity generation and cars. We need also to reduce emissions from shipping, from aviation, from heavy-duty trucks and heavy industries. And within these sectors, the technologies required to achieve decarbonization are still at prototype or demonstration phases. So we need to scale up research and innovation efforts too. As by 2050, half of the required reductions in CO2 emissions come from technologies that are not yet available on the market. So these technologies are related to the use and production of hydrogen, to further electrification of end-use sectors, so buildings, transport industry, technologies for carbon capture, utilization and storage, and also the use of sustainable bioenergy. This means that really the next decade is not only a decade of deployment of the technologies that we have already today, but also a decade of innovation for the technologies that we have yet to bring into the market. And these requirements are not antagonists in the fight against climate change, but rather two sides of the same coin. In our report, we have also provided 400 milestones related to technology deployment and innovation. And here our message is clear: having an ultimate goal to reach net zero by 2050 shouldn't distract us from designing policies and clear milestones also for the near term. In fact, achieving near-term milestones is clearly critical to ensure that the long-term targets remains within reach. So, for example, we have highlighted that by 2035, there can be no new sales of conventional cars if we are to stay on the net zero pathway. And this is something that has been set up now by the Commission in the case of the European Union, also sticking with the date of 2035. So this kind of policy or milestone implies that the deployment of EVs and charging infrastructure is no more a chicken and egg problem, but we need to accelerate their deployment simultaneously, and we clearly need to start this now. Of course, with our report, we recognize that our net zero scenario is not the pathway, but a pathway. However, we do know, and this has been highlighted again by the latest IPCC report, that we need immediate and rapid actions. We need also all technologies, and we have simply no time to waste. So clearly, this is where we need to go to keep the door to 1.5 degrees open. But currently, is this where our governments are leading us to? So here we're talking about the potential CO2 emissions increase that our current policy environment could lead us to. So if we think about, the past, over the last 20 years, we have seen that CO2 emissions have continuously grown despite a small plateau in the 2010s. And before the Paris Agreement, so some time ago, before 2015, in our projection, our baseline scenario projected a continuous growth of emissions leading to an increase of 3.5 degrees in global average temperature. So in other words, a clearly unsustainable world. Since the Paris Agreement, our scenarios have evolved, given that they take into account global policy developments. And fortunately, there was a positive evolution in energy policies. And now with the current policy environment, so taking into account all policies that are in or enacted by law, so not net zero targets if they are not implied in the law, these policies will lead us to a temperature increase of 2.6 degrees. And all announcements, so this is what we call the stated policy scenarios, so the blue wedge that you can see on this figure. And all announcements made just before the COP26 and during the COP26 in terms of net zero targets would lead us to a world with temperature rise limited to 1.8 degrees. So this is not far from 1.5, but we know, of course, that every difference from 1.5 matters, and many regions are already experiencing the severe impacts of climate change. We have seen extreme heat waves. We have seen a lot of droughts, floods. So with the current temperature rise of only 1.1 degrees. So we need to boost our ambition to keep that 1.5 degree door open. And I'll be repeating myself, but we really must scale up deployment and implementation to meet all these targets. So this is the picture in terms of CO2 emissions, so still far from what we need to achieve if we would like to achieve a net zero by 2050 CO2 emissions. And what does that mean in terms of energy? What would be the implications on energy markets if we go only ahead only with the policies announced and engraved in law, so the stated policy scenarios? Energy demand, as you can see on this figure, continues to grow, with the next decade looking pretty much similar as the past decade. So it means that the share of fossil fuels in the global energy mix declines only slightly from 79% today to 75% in 2030. So with the current policies. In the steps, in this scenario, global oil demand exceeds 29 levels by 2023. So we see a rebound after the pandemic, and natural gas is around 15% higher. Of course, those scenarios will be updated during the summer, given the current situation and the current context and the new policy environment, as some countries have put additional policy on the table. However, the announced pledge do change the picture. So all the announced pledge to reach net zero target by 2050 that were made before COP and during the COP So these pledges do change the picture for global energy markets, and already by 2030, the share of unabated fossil fuels declines to 72% of the global energy mix, so from 79 today to 72. But of course, the picture of energy market is drastically different in a net zero world. Already by 2030, we'll see oil demand falling close to 70 million barrels per day, so more than 30 million barrels per day below what we have in the steppes. And this is notably due to the rapid electrification of transport, but of course also meeting growing demand for electricity, so from the electrification of transport or higher use of heat pumps in buildings and industry, while simultaneously phasing out fossil fuel generation in the power mix requires a quadrupling of solar PV and wind deployment relative to today, as I said at the beginning. So here reaching 1,000 gigawatts in 2030. So again, this scale of the changes required in the energy system are huge, but we still have reason to remain optimistic. The pathway to limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is narrow, but it is achievable. In the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of announcements, lots of pledges, so we can now enter the decade of action, implementation of policies to meet announced pledge, and also raising ambition in line with the net zero target. So I've discussed where we'd like to go, where our governments are leading us to, but now coming to the point on where are we currently. So I'll start with some bad news and disappointing records from the energy sector. In 2021, CO2 emissions reached their highest levels ever. We have achieved now 36.3 billion tons of CO2 emissions in the year of 2021. Sorry. So the annual increase from 2020 to 2021 of 2 billion tons was the largest annual increase in history. This increase of CO2 emissions could be attributed to a strong rebound in economic activity, but also adverse weather and unprecedented constraints in global energy markets. However, clearly this number on CO2 emission highlights that so far the recovery from the pandemic has not been the sustainable recovery that we were hoping for. And now if I turn to investments in the energy sector, for many years, within the agency, within the IEA, we have raised clearly warning signals about a looming mismatch in investments between oil and gas supply and clean energy technologies. Today, we see a clear imbalance between these two components of the energy systems. On the one hand, we observe that upstream investments in oil and gas are now at half at their level in 2014, even though oil and gas demand has not experienced a similar trend. And this indicates that in practice, the level of investments in 2020 of oil and gas supply investment is in line with the net zero pathway. But on the other hand, clean energy investments are still far from the level required to steer us onto a net zero pathway. So also another point that I wanted to highlight is the fact that what we are seeing today in global energy markets, and this was true even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is not an outcome of the clean energy transition, but rather of a clear mismatch between investments in oil and gas supply and clean energy technologies, as you can see on that figure. And as I mentioned, so as we have also experienced a major energy crisis as of March this year, with the unprecedented price spikes in fossil fuel commodities. In some case, price soared up by up by 16 times the level they were at only last year. So with these supply constraints, along with the growing demand stemming from a global economy trying to recover from the crisis, and also linked to some uncertainty arising from supply shocks and sanctions linked to the war in Ukraine, we have here clearly the perfect storm in today's energy market. So it will be, as I said, completely wrong to place the blame for this on clean energy transitions. So I mentioned Russia's invasions of Ukraine, and in this context, within the IEA, we also wanted to assist the EU by providing a plan on how to reduce its historical reliance on Russian fossil fuel imports that could in turn have significant impacts also on cutting down Russia's revenue and diminishing their ability to prolong the war. So that's what we have published in March. So our first 10 points plan on gas, highlighting measures which could be implemented by next winter to reduce the EU's reliance on Russian gas imports by a third. And these measures encompass actions all along the energy system, so from diversifying supply sources to the fast-tracking new wind and solar projects, or postponing the phase-out of some nuclear plants, but also accelerating the rollout of heat pumps and renovation for buildings. So points that I have mentioned already in line with our net zero scenario. So clearly there is an opportunity here to address both the energy security issues and the energy transition issue to make sure that we can fight both at the same time. So I mentioned a few here. We see how we can reduce Russia's EU's reliance on Russian gas by several measures. So to mention the ones on the demand side, clearly heat pumps have a role to play if we want to reduce the reliance on gas for heating our buildings, but also accelerating the rollout of solar PV and wind in the electricity generation system. We have also highlighted in this plan the crucial role that citizens could play just by reducing their thermostat by 1 degree. This could save 10 BCM of gas demand for next winter. So a very important area as well. But of course, Russia is not responsible only of gas, of EU gas imports, but is also a key player in terms of EU's oil imports. So that's why we have also designed a new 10-point plan related to oil on measures that could be implemented this summer, because in summer we always see an increase of oil demand linked to more traveling. So we came up with an additional 10-point plan on how advanced economies, so not only EU, but also countries like the US, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, could reduce oil demand by 2.7 MBD. So another reduction in addition to the stock release that IEA member countries have done. So to make sure that we can reduce the strains on oil markets. But as I mentioned, there is also an important role to play for citizens, and that's why we came up also with an additional plan called Play My Part to highlight measures that citizens could take to ensure that they could help Ukraine during Russia's invasions. So this is called, as I said, Playing My Part, and all these measures could not only bring down the EU's reliance on Russian fossil fuels, but they can also reduce the EU citizens' energy bills, given that they have experienced very high price spikes, also depending on the countries. And they could also demonstrate solidarity with the Ukrainian people. So we have highlighted all these points in line with and we have worked on those points with the European Commission in May. And finally, I would like to finish my presentation to say that looking around, it's clear that the journey to a more secure and sustainable energy system will not be a smooth one, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine makes it crystal clear that on the reason to press ahead, there will inevitably be a scramble for short-term alternatives to fossil fuels from Russia. We have already observed that coal power generation is increasing in some countries as a response to very high gas prices. But clearly, we must avoid a situation where our immediate response lock us in longer-term problems, and in the end, prolong our reliance on volatile fossil fuels. So the tragic situation in Ukraine puts so much into uncertainty. However, one thing is clear, it's that the shift to a cleaner energy system is a way out of our present circumstances. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Very nice presentation. I would like to have a few questions for your presentation. So whatever you have said about the net zero emission is from entirely from the energy sectors. So in our country like India, it is the agriculture is the major part which covers the major portion of the area. Any technologies or emission control is advised for the agricultural area?
Thank you very much for your question. Indeed, all our scenarios look only at the energy sector, and this is clearly the biggest difference between our scenario called the APS, where we take into account these net zero targets, and our scenario called the NZD, because in the APS we take also into account the national circumstances and national studies, where a lot of countries will still like to rely on offsetting emissions outside the energy sector, so from the land use sector. And in the case of the net zero scenario, we achieve net zero CO2 emissions for the energy sector without relying on any offset outside the energy sector. To come back to your point on agriculture, I'm afraid I cannot provide you further details and answers on which technologies could enable that, given that my expertise is clearly on the energy field, and I wouldn't pretend I can provide you an answer there. But I think indeed, depending on the circumstances and on the countries, I mean, some countries are would like to rely, as I said, on offsetting emissions outside the energy sector to make sure that they can still emit within the energy sector, or on how to offset emissions from the agricultural sector or from the waste sector. But here, clearly, we look at the energy sector picture, even though we are also in contact with our colleagues from the OECD who looked at the global greenhouse gas picture.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Is any questions in the chat, Stefan? Okay. So I have one, Stephanie, about all these initiatives that you are sharing today with us. What type of mechanism do you have to really share to all these sectors? For example, it is very interesting that this initiative calls the playing my part. I'm really interested on that. But how do you share it with the different sectors?
I mean, that's a very broad and a very interesting question. But indeed, I mean, our reports are meant for different kind of audience, I would say. So we are trying to advise first governments and policymakers to make sure that policies go into the right directions, and that we clearly close the gap between the ambition and the implementation, to make sure that we have the right policies to achieve the targets that countries may have. And here we are talking to ministries, to governments, to make sure that those policies are enacted in the law. Then we have also reports that are more going towards the financing sector, because clearly to make sure that this transition happens, we need the right investments. And we need the right investments not only from the public sector, but also clearly from the private sector. And here there is a role for governments to play to make sure that the financing sector sees an opportunity and not too many risks to invest in this energy transition. But we need also to highlight to the private sector the opportunity to invest in those clean energy technologies, because this is where we'll need a big scale up of investments. Now, if the way we are also talking to citizens, as you have said on playing my part, was a way also to make sure that citizens understand that indeed everyone in the energy system has a role to play to make sure that the energy transition happens. And this is somehow also something that we have witnessed also in the past years, that sometimes local governments are pushing even more compared to national governments. So indeed, there is a role for everyone to play, and we are just trying to make sure that our messages are understood and heard by everyone.